Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at today's panel. We're lucky to be joined by such esteemed experts on the region, and I'm very eager to hear their thoughts on the developing threat in the Maghreb. I'm going to start by introducing everyone on the panel briefly and then asking them for some opening remarks. Their detailed biographies are in the programs before you, and I'm eager to hear what they have to say, so I'll invite you to look at those biographies for more information on their background. To my left is Dr. Kim Cragen, and she's a Senior Research Fellow for Counterterrorism at National Defense University. To her left is Dr. Michael Ayari, and he's a Senior Analyst for Tunisia at the International Crisis Group. And to his left is Dr. Mohammed Masba, and he's a Research Fellow for the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University and an Associate Fellow at Chatham House. I'm going to ask our panel to just go in that order and answer just a couple opening topic questions. Dr. Cragen, I was wondering if we could start by if you could talk a little bit about foreign fighter flow. The trends that you're seeing, and specifically, what are the implications for Algeria?
Sure, thanks very much. As you see in my bio, I'm the Counterterrorism Fellow at the National Defense University. So for those of you who aren't familiar with NDU, we're actually part of the U.S. Professional Military Education Program, which means I actually have to start all my comments by saying nothing I say represents the Joint Staff or the Department of Defense or the U.S. government in general. I should also say that as having the portfolio for counterterrorism, I work trans-regionally, so sometimes I'm in Southeast Asia and sometimes in North Africa. In the past 2 years, I've been to Tunisia and Algeria as part of this research, but I don't consider myself a regional expert, and so I think that should be taken into context. So my comments are going to focus on the foreign fighters and then what next and the implications for North Africa. Let's start with some basic numbers. According to U.S. government numbers, we've all heard this, there are about 40,000 foreign fighters who traveled to Syria and Iraq to fight against Assad. Just to point out that Turkey has higher numbers. Their numbers are 53,000 with an additional 11,000 women and children. And the reason why you see such a difference in numbers is due to a definition of what is a foreign fighter. Did they actually make it to Syria, or did they get turned back in Turkey? And so you see some differences across the numbers that are being reported from North Africa as well as a result of this. But, okay, of these 40,000, official estimates from the North African countries, so to me this is Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, Egypt, and Algeria, are about 7,500. And that's in descending order, Tunisia first, Morocco, Libya, Egypt, and Algeria. The academic estimates, not the official estimates, are somewhat higher. The academic estimates go to between 10 and 13,000 from these 5 countries. Okay, but let's start with the 7,500. Of the 7,500 foreign fighters officially from these countries who traveled to Syria and Iraq, only about 1,600 or 22% have already returned home. And these are, again, official numbers from those countries. Comparatively speaking, 22% is a very low number. The previous panel mentioned the Afghan Arabs and the returnees in the mid-1990s. We had as many as 70% of those from Algeria actually returned directly home. Other countries, it was about 80% returned specifically home. So 22% so far is not too bad. But then, as also the previous panel was mentioning, you have to widen your aperture and say, okay, maybe they didn't return to their home countries, but they returned to the region. And maybe they went to Sinai, they went to Libya, and if you broaden that out, there's about 900 foreign fighters who fought in Syria who have already returned to Libya. And about half of those are from North African countries. There's also a fairly significant Saudi population. So right now you're looking at about 2,000 foreign terrorist fighters who have operational experience in Syria and Iraq who have already returned to North Africa and those 5 countries that I mentioned. Okay, so specifically on Algeria, generally speaking, as was mentioned before, the foreign fighter returnees to Algeria is quite low. Official numbers right now coming out of Algeria are around 500. The academic the academic is around 1,100, with about 300 killed on the battlefields of Syria and Iraq, and an additional 200 Algeria fighters in Libya. That's compared to 7,000 Algerians who fought in Afghanistan. So actually, these are, again, relatively speaking, quite low. In fact, Algeria is one of the few countries that has reversed course when it comes to the trend in foreign fighters. Most of the time, what you see is consecutive conflict after consecutive conflict, those same, we call them facilitation networks or recruitment networks, the numbers get larger and larger and larger. In Algeria, they've gotten smaller and smaller and smaller, of course, because of, as was mentioned, the national tragedy or this massive conflict that took place. That's not to say that Algeria has not had issues with Islamic State recruitment. The security services have arrested and disrupted a number of recruitment cells. I was there in May, and they had just arrested somebody who was actively recruiting about 300 people on Facebook, and they had busted the cell. It was in downtown Algiers. But this is what's interesting about IS recruitment in Algeria, is that it doesn't seem to me that AQIM and the Islamic State are competing for the same recruits. AQIM seems to be using their traditional family and social networks to recruit people, while Islamic State has gone online. And so as a result, you have a different type of recruitment and a different profile, to the extent that we can even go with profiles of recruits, and I find that really interesting. Also, just a couple things about Algeria, since I've been asked to talk about them. I think we heard it from the previous panel, but given its historical experiences, this is a country that is very, very worried about foreign fighter returnees because they were such a huge part of the civil conflict. They've already had laws on the books that made it illegal to go to another conflict, to travel from the 1990s. They reinforced this very quickly in 2015, and they worked very quickly to shut down the facilitation networks. So I think to compare Algeria to the other countries in the region is maybe a little bit of a misnomer. Okay. Impact. I actually have a timer going on my watch. So, I want to take a few minutes to talk about the likely impact. Because historically foreign fighters have returned home to establish local terrorist cells, we heard previously, they've participated in smuggling rings, and then they've helped finance other conflicts. We're already seeing examples of this throughout North Africa from the Daesh, the IS foreign fighter returnees. In addition, you can actually track specific attacks that are linked to these returnees. As of October, Islamic State cells outside of Syria and Iraq had conducted about 510 attacks, and about 120 of these took place in North Africa. The foreign fighter returnees have participated in 15% of these attacks. These aren't sort of your drive-by shootings at checkpoints, but real terrorist operations. 15% for North Africa. Actually, the rest of the world, the average is 25%. So far, I'm never the good news person, but so far for North Africa, foreign fighters haven't been as actively involved in terrorist attacks, and I think this has a lot to say about the security services and how they have tried to mitigate the threat from foreign fighters, at least so far. So what are my biggest concerns? I'm going to echo what the previous panel said. My single biggest concern when it comes to foreign fighters is what's going to happen when those who are in prison get out, because most of them are only going to be in prison for 4 or 5 years. This applies to foreign fighter returnees, but also individuals who are arrested on their way to Syria and Iraq, or individuals who are being arrested now for local attacks. Some of these individuals are in prison, some of them are under house arrest and just being monitored. And when you're talking about resources, it takes a lot of resources to monitor somebody. And I'm worried in 4 or 5 years, these countries are going to decide those resources are better used elsewhere. And so these are my concern. Quite frankly, I'm also worried about foreign fighters from other countries who decide to go to North Africa. I think Libya and Sinai we've talked about. I'm worried about countries that are revoking dual citizens, and they're revoking their citizenship, and so these individuals can't go home, and so they decide to go to North Africa. And then, of course, I'm also worried about what I refer to as regional foreign fighters. So individuals who might not have gone to Syria and Iraq, they might not go to the Philippines, they might not go to Afghanistan, but they decide to travel and stay within the Maghreb. And as we know, there are already an estimated 3,000 to 6,000 who've already traveled to Libya. So in conclusion, I don't want to leave the impression that I think that foreign fighters are the single most important threat for North Africa, but I do think that even small numbers can have a significant impact. And I also think they represent a unique challenge to countries as they try to imprison them, put them through the judicial system, and then rehabilitate them. I think you heard that alluded to, but let's just be specific. These guys are very tough to put through a rehabilitation program. And finally, I think that history has taught us that no one country can manage this alone, especially when it comes to foreign fighters. And this is going to require a deeper level of coordination than we already see going on in the region. I think both geographically, but then within countries, between law enforcement and other security services as well. And so I think that we collectively need to get this right, or we're going to be back here in another 5 years talking about this exact same phenomenon, probably in another country.
Thank you. I think it's so helpful to talk about both that broad issue of foreign fighters and then the areas where Algeria might fit patterns of the region and where it doesn't. So thank you for that. Dr. Ayari, I'd like to know if you could walk us through sort of your thoughts in terms of the rising jihadi Salafi threat as it pertains to Tunisia.
Yes, thank you. Yes, of course, as Mr. Akrut said before, Tunisia is much more a spillover country in a sense that it's not the epicenter of growth of jihadism. It suffers from the anchoring of jihadism in Libya, especially. So we have to keep that in mind, and to keep in mind, I think that the most important thing is to increase the capacity of reaction and resilience of the society and institutions, because lots of things can happen in Tunisia, and especially in the upcoming years, I think we'll have lots of mutations of the jihadist scene that for the moment that we cannot see them and forebode them very clearly. In a sense, there have been 3 stages in Tunisia after what we call the revolution in 2011. First, it was between 2011 and 2013. There was the growth of that we call Ansar Sharia. It was a movement that attempted to unify the different groups and jihadist groups with a project of an institutionalization and nationalizations of the international jihadist movement in Tunisia. It has failed. In 2013, there was the first measures of repressions. There is the growth of jihadist attack backed by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And it was the moment where jihadism in Tunisia was very popular in peri-urban area and popular districts and all that stuff. And from 2016, after a failed attack in the city of Ben Garden in the south of Tunisia, at the Libyan-Tunisia border, we entered, I can see, in post-ISIS period, in a sense. And there are new regional uncertainties, and I think that the situation in the Gulf, contrary that we can say, will impact in the form of jihadism. We'll see that in upcoming years, maybe in 5 or 6 years. I speak a little bit about that. For the moment in Tunisia, we have to step back a little bit. They are like, according to security forces, like 250 armed jihadists. That's all. They are in the mountains, small mountains at the Algerian border, in Jebel Shahambi. There are people linked to Al-Qaeda and people linked to ISIS. And they are like sleeping cells, like maybe 100 people, or a sleeping cell of 2 or 4 people that are gathered on the territory. And that might play a role, a punctual supply, in case of deterioration of the security situation at the regional level. And there is the case of returners. It's the main problem. Around already 1,000 came back, and maybe 1,000 else will come back. For the moment, lots of them are in jail between 3 and 8 years, as you said, and it's the problem is after what they're going to do. Others are controlled. But at the same time, we have to step back a little bit, because it's not like Algeria in the 80s, when there was the returners of the Afghan from Afghanistan. Because in Tunisia, there is no radical Islamist mass movement. In the political sense, where they can help them, with their knowledge and their logistic gift, if I can speak like that. So, of course, they could play the role, these people, but it depends on the regional situation. What are the objectives of jihadists in Tunisia? It's regional. Tunisia is just a corridor, in fact. They don't want to seize power in Tunisia. They want to target Algeria, in a sense. Because there is nothing in Tunisia to say, and Algeria is the big pearl, and Algerians know that. The stability in Tunisia is a question of national security for Algeria. Some people say that they want an Islamic Caliphate in Kairouan, in Tunisia, to go back to the Aghlabid state and all that stuff. But what we can notice, that terrorist attack in Tunisia didn't aim to destabilize the country, in a sense, because Tunisia is a place where they can organize themselves. They can recruit. They didn't kill Tunisians except the forces of security, because for them they say that they are tyranns, Just 15 Tunisians died, apart from security forces, of course, died in collateral damages. And jihadists, they want to use Tunisia as a corridor in order to make the link between jihadists in Libya and to target Algeria. It's regional, and it's very important to gather that, to understand that. First, we have to understand, too, that ISIS in Tunisia, for jihadists, is seen as a counter-revolutionary force. Every people I met in Tunisia, jihadists, close to jihadists, were from Al-Qaeda. They said that for them, ISIS was like a manipulation of security forces and things like that. It was, and people who are like students or intellectuals, they believe in Tartusi, Makdisi, Al-Qaeda, all these people, and not at all in ISIS. And it is important because in Tunisia, there are, people are surprised sometimes, there are intellectuals of jihadism, like in the 60s, they were Marxists and all that stuff at university. It's people who believe that. There are lots of them, and the other part, the volunteers, is like people said before, it's like much more criminals, mercenaries, we were paid, and we are not dangerous. They are dangerous, of course, because they know how to master weapons, but once there is no money, there is no fight for them, so we have to keep that in mind. At the same time, Libya, of course, is very dangerous for Tunisia because, all the small political groups, political and military groups can instrumentalize jihadists. They can close their eyes on movement of Tunisian jihadists, of course, and use jihadists as a tool of blackmail with Tunisia. And we know that Tunisia has to balance its position between all the force in Libya, and it's very difficult because it's changed a lot, and all the geopolitical axis doesn't fit anymore in Libya. Everything is divided, Zintan, Tripoli, and all that stuff. So Tunisia has to take care. Take care of what, especially? Because if we want to sum up, I know we have to enter the details map much more, but in Libya, the problem is not just to take natural resources. It's a rent-seeking, it's the tracks to legalize the money, it's banking system, it's letter of credit, all that stuff. And Tunisia has lots of links with that. There is lots of money laundering in Tunisia. So what happened in Libya has a clear repercussion, consequences on what happened in Tunisia and in Libya. We have to understand that too. At the same time, Tunisia is a place where there is lots of money transfer. International companies play a role, with bank interconnections, and we have to take that in mind. Just to finish on some perspective, I have time, or it's a... okay, thank you. What we say, it might sound weird, but people in the field work, in Algeria and Tunisia, they fear in the next 5 years the growth of Shiite jihadism. I think it can sound very weird, but there is, how could I say, Saudi, we played, who are very powerful in Libya through everybody, through Kara, the Wahhabite and all these people. They are with Haftar and they are against Haftar at the same time. They are in Tripoli. And maybe some forces can use and can make and grow like a Hezbollah-type movement. In the next years, it's what people fear because there is a penetration and lots of conversion of Shiism, especially in Tunisia. We have to remember that there was the Fatimid state in North Africa, in Africa, and maybe in the next years, maybe people who say that are linked to, could I say, security forces, and they are a little bit paranoid, things like that. But maybe we have to see that the same polarization that we have in Lebanon or everywhere can happen in North Africa. And the fact of collaborating with Iran in the fieldwork in the name of anti-terrorists is a good thing, but after maybe Iran or Shiite will win better than the others. So just the anti-terrorist collaboration is not enough. It needs a political strategy of long-term to everything. At the end, for Tunisia, what could we say? There's lots of effort have been made by the authorities, of course, the improvement of coordination of security, thanks to the National Security Council and all that stuff, but challenge remains. There is the problem of money laundering, as I told you, is the heart of the war. There is the problem of applying constitution, because the problem in Tunisia now that the President of the Republic tends and the political parties tend to personalize the channel for political discussions, and it fragilizes the institutions, and we don't know what can happen if there is a succession of the emptiness of the presidential power and things like that. It's the same thing everywhere. Haftar is ill in Tunisia, in Chad is old, in Algeria, in Tunisia, so lots of things must be anticipated now. Prevention is important, of course, because in Tunisia there have been lots of measures of repression, efficient, of course, but it's not enough, especially in jail. In jail, it's a caricature, of course, of the society. Peri-urban areas, the problems of corruption, of police brutality, the absence of morality of institutions. It's a very important driver of violent extremism. The social regional discrimination and all that stuff, and so on. To finish, I think that the North Africa, there will be new challenges and new development of movement. Al-Qaeda is to be followed, because for people, Al-Qaeda is the main threat. At the same time, maybe start research to understand the complexity or the eventuality of this Shiism, jihadism. Maybe it's possible, I don't know. And at the same time, to know that Libya is much more complicated than Iraq. So take care.
Thank you. It's interesting to see how much Tunisia is shaped by events around it and coming into it, particularly in comparison to Algeria. So thank you for that. Dr. Masba, I was wondering if you could tackle the same question vis-a-vis Morocco. What are some of the threats as you see vis-a-vis Morocco? What are things that we should be thinking about that perhaps are unique to that country?
Thank you very much for this invitation. I will try to answer 3 questions actually in my presentation. First is what the level of threat regarding Morocco, and the second, what are the recent dynamics within Salafi Jihadi scene in Morocco, and finally, how can we better understand the process of radicalization in Morocco. I was asked not to talk about how governments dealt with the radicals, but I'm ready to answer in the Q&A session. So the first question, what is the current situation? Or Morocco is safe? We might say that for the moment, Morocco is safe from imminent terrorist threats. And Morocco is the only country in North Africa that was not attacked by Daesh since 2011. So this was attributed actually to the stability of the political regime, as well as the effectiveness of its security services in deterring and preventing terrorist attacks in Morocco. But this is not the whole picture. The situation is more complex, and radicalization actually is on rise. While security services succeeded to prevent terrorist attacks, the radicalization of a new generation of jihadi is on the rise. And this is a kind of dilemma. I will try to give up some snapshots to understand it. So, as Ambassador Tamek said, there is at least 1,600 Moroccans who traveled to Syria since 2011, and Moroccan authorities claimed the destruction of at least 47 terrorist cells since in the last 3 years, only in the last 3 years, and 162 since 2002. Among them, there is around 40-something cell linked to Daesh. In the same time, it prevented hundreds from traveling to Syria after 2015, and not to count a lot of Moroccans who has been engaged or involved in terrorist attacks in Europe, as you know, in Madrid, 2004, and more recently in Barcelona attacks and the case of Abdelhamid Abaoud. So if we put this together, these pieces together, it is difficult to assume that Morocco is totally immune from terrorism. but in the same time, it's for the moment able to control and manage the situation through different mechanisms, mainly security, but also there are other components in the strategy, in the CVE policy, namely the socio-economic development, the restructuration of the religious field, and more recently, somehow the de-radicalization program. But I will discuss this a few minutes later in the Q&A question because I have some slightly different opinion on that point. So let me talk about the new generation of jihadi because there is a lot of discussion about it. A lot of people ask or say or made observation that we are observing a shift within Salafi jihadism, not only in Morocco, but across the North African countries, that this new generation is quite different from the previous one. I think, yes, there is a new generation. But for me, it's difficult to call them as jihadi in the same way that we called the previous generation, not because they don't believe in jihadism or in doing terrorism, but actually they are new and totally different from the previous one. They are different on 3 or 4 levels. First is the process of radicalization. It became more and more faster and quicker. We call them the fast food jihadi, which means that in a very short way, it's like McDonald's. Before, if you understand a little bit North African culture, the tagine, the Moroccan tagine takes time to be prepared. It requires a lot of ingredients and time. This is the old generation of jihadi. They required a lot of time to learn the tenets of the ideology, read huge books of Abu Mus'ab Suri, Da'wat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya al-Alamiyya, which is 1,600 pages that you need 3 years to finish, and read a lot of books and listening to the audios, etc. But this new generation actually, very quickly, in 2, 3, 4 months, they get radicalized. And no one can understand how this process is enacted so quickly. I mean, we can discuss this later, but this is the first difference, is that it's very quick process of radicalization. In 2003, Casablanca attack, people who planned the attacks, it took them 6 months between the first meeting and the perpetrating the attacks. And now you can see that some normal citizens, just in few weeks, they radicalize and they travel to Syria. And this is something very striking, and I don't know from a research perspective, how can we explain it? Yeah, and the second aspect is that the former generation was more serious about ideology than the new one. My own observation, as well as some leaked ISIS document in last year, reveals that these new recruits have limited knowledge of Islam. They are really not very well educated at the matter of religion. And you can see that in the prison, Mr. Tamek said that 202 has been recruited within prison from petty criminals. So those are people who are not really religious and have really very standard or basic knowledge of Islam. Yeah, and a very interesting dynamic. I still have some time? Okay. And a very interesting dynamic is that after the crackdown on Salafi jihadi scene in Morocco after 2003, there was Moroccan authorities put the sheikhs and their followers, the Salafi jihadi sheikhs, in the prison, and then this has created a kind of vacuum in the Salafi jihadi scene and a kind of ideological void, because before that there was the traditional relation between sheikh and followers, more or even though there was no strong organization. It was a loose network of different groups, but they were circled around one sheikh at a respective community. But after that, when the authorities cracked down on these communities, and there was a gap or a void in these areas. And after their release from prison, the radicalized Salafi jihadi sheikhs, they passed through a process of revision, ideological revision, and de-radicalization. They were sidelined by this new generation. They lost credibility, and they are even being a target of this new generation. This is something very interesting. In some videos online, the new jihadi, young jihadi of 20-something, released video threatening the sheikhs as infidels and threatened them to death. And it's very interesting. Except there is one or two cases, two exceptions of this dichotomy between the old generation and the new, which is the case of Brahim bin Shukroon, who has been revealed before, who was an ex-Guantanamo detainee who left into Syria in 2013, and he created Harakat Sham al-Islam, and he succeeded eventually to attract hundreds of Moroccans from both generations, the old and the new generation. But except him, I think most of the sheikhs, including those who are still in prison and belong to the old fashion of Al-Qaeda, I mean, who became now old-fashioned, are in a conflict or a tense relation with this new generation. Can we draw a profile of this new generation? I think it's complex. I mean, they belong to different categories, social categories, and also different regions from Morocco. But we can draw a large, or let's say a prototype that's an ideal type for this category. It's mainly, I mean, we can say that 70% of them at least are young male between 18 and 24 who lives in marginalized area at the outskirts of big and medium cities, who have limited and formal and religious knowledge, education, and more importantly, who works in unstable activities at the informal economic sector. This is a very important element. Most of radicals works as street vendors, seasoned employers, and stuff like that. And for instance, for example, just for the case of street vendors, are in permanent conflict and tensity with local authorities because it's an unregulated economic sector, and they have to struggle on a daily basis with the local authority, and this creates a frustration. And it's not a surprise that Muhammad al-Bouazizi was a street vendor, and he burned himself. So this category is deemed more exposed to jihadism, not because it's more religious, but because of socio-economic fragility. And this is my argument here, is that we should not underestimate ideology, but also we should not think that it's the primary driver for this new generation. This new generation first radicalized because it's socio-economic condition, and then they look for a explanation or a kind of ideology is instrumentalized in a way that it gives sense to their situation. And sometimes they are very, the jihadis sometimes are very aware of this situation. They say if the situation was better, I mean, I was talking with some of them, and in some situation off record, they said, look, it's because of socioeconomic condition. We can't travel anymore to Europe, and also the situation is very hard. But more importantly, because jihadi groups actually answer two main questions that the others could not provide. The first is the question of who we are. It's question of identity. It answered this very important question now in the Arab and the Muslim societies is the question of identity, who we are. It gives them a very basic answer. We belong to a community of 1.5 billion, and that is under imminent threat from outside and the tyrants. So you have to defend, and no one is defending your brothers and sisters in Syria, and you have to do it yourself. So it's very basic stuff. And we need to create an Islamic state and to apply the Sharia law, which is very appealing for young. But also, it answered the second question, which is actually, what is my role in life? It's usefulness. I mean, jihadi groups, whether we like it or not, succeeded to empower youth. I mean, this is what all governments in the Middle East are talking in the last few years is about empowering youth and giving them opportunity. But in reality, it was jihadi groups who provided that. Unfortunately, it gives them social status, power, wives, houses, indemnities, etc. So this together, and I will finish in 30 seconds, this together could help us to understand the recent dynamics of jihadi in Morocco, and also it provides us with keys to understand the development of jihadism across the region. So for policy consideration, and here I will finish, it is necessary to understand it's not ideology actually or nihilism that drive those young Muslims to kill themselves, but actually it is the psychological and social vulnerability at an early stage. Ideology comes later just as a legitimizing forces. But the main driver is the feeling of injustice and strong grievances that are there since a few decades. And if we don't take this seriously, we cannot provide long-term solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, there are a few connective threads that I heard in all of your opening remarks was that the numbers aren't large. The Islamic State, as we've come to know it in Iraq and Syria, doesn't necessarily appeal to the region, nor does it have the space to develop, given the government institutions that are in place. And yet, there is a new kind of young radicalization happening. And so my question, I'll ask you, Dr. Craig, and if you could kick us off, is it an oversimplification to say that the Islamic State can't sort of take territory the way we think of it as in Iraq and Syria? And if not, what is the end state as these youth see it?
So let me first start by saying, I'm not going to be the person who says the numbers are not large. I mean, they're actually quite large. Just for comparative purposes, the total number of foreign fighters who went to fight US forces in Iraq was 5,000. So you already have more than that, even at the lowest numbers from North Africa to Syria and Iraq. So I don't think they're low. But I do think the issue of, is it an oversimplification to say they're not going to take territory? I think that's actually true. Going back to all the ideologues that we were saying that nobody actually reads, but the terrorism analysts these days. I mean, I do think there is an element of they don't have to take an entire country, but they just have to control some territory. This is the concern for Libya, is, okay, maybe they won't be up north, but maybe they'll be down south in Libya, and if they can control a little bit of territory in Libya, is that sufficient in the border regions area? I think the Sinai is similar. If they control a little bit of territory in the Sinai and can threaten Cairo, which is basically what they're doing now, is that sufficient? And I think it's not as big as what they did in Mosul and in Raqqa, but I think, is it sufficient? Is it a concern? Yes. And is it sufficient for them to hold territory enough to rebuild? Absolutely. So that's how I'd answer that.
But does that Islamic State then resemble what we saw in Iraq and Syria? Do we see an adoption of tactics, but maybe adjustments then for a particular region? Is that a fair way to think about some of the things we should be watching going forward?
Right, so this is the problem with these groups. So not to go too far out, but let's take Yemen, pre-major crisis, chronic civil war. You had the AQAP was trying to say, look, let's not beat up the tribes to try and maintain our safe haven in Makalla City. So, but they just couldn't bring themselves to do it. You know, they still use these oppressive measures on the local population. So I think that is going to be the key, is if they can hold remote territory where maybe there aren't major population centers for a little bit as rebuilding, then maybe you might see something like Raqqa, but it's not Raqqa because it's not a major population center, or Mosul. Right now, they're not going to be able to do that. But that doesn't mean they're not going to be able to do it in 5 or 8 years, which is, I think, the big concern for these regions, yeah.
Dr. Ayari, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the implications of events in Libya on Tunisia. And I'm curious if you could sort of give us a sense in terms of what are some of the dynamics that you see imminently threatening Tunisia, and what are some of the ones you think we should be thinking about long term, given that porous border between Western Libya and Tunisia?
You mean the problem that the deterioration of the Libyan situation can...
That's right.
Yes, of course. In a sense that the main problem is economic, because we know that the border population lives thanks to smuggling and all that stuff, and the borders have been closed during the 80s, something like that, and there was lots of misery at this moment. It was very difficult. So it's the first thing. After, there is the possibility of migrations, of poor Libyans in Tunisia, because if they are rich, there is no problem because society can can take them. But if they don't have money, maybe there can be migrations, and it may be a problem. And there is the problem of controlling this border, because it's very difficult. You cannot close it, and so people can enter. So it's the main thing. And after, the fact is that if there is not an improvement of at the same time of external intelligence service in Libya, in Tunisia, it's very difficult to trust the informations that come from Libya. And if the situation grows harsher and harsher between all the camps, there will be less credibility in the informations that they give. So it's a direct threat.
Is there a tipping point that you're looking at in terms of when the dynamics in Libya fundamentally change the security situation in Tunisia? Because from my estimation, I could be wrong, we haven't seen that yet. I'm curious, are there metrics that you're looking at specifically that fundamentally change the balance in Tunisia?
Yeah, it might. So it might, because it's regional, And even jihadists themselves in Tunisia, they are of different nationalities. You have Algerians, Moroccan, you have Libyans. It's a regional. They see things as regional. When they speak of the Aghlabid state, of Kiran as a Khalifa, Tunisia, it's nothing for them, and for something. But I mean what is worrying too. It's lots of these people wait a signal. They say that they wait a signal, and the signal it's a regional crisis, not just a national one. So this is the reason why the institutions are to be stabilized and strengthened, but in a good manner, not in an authority one.
And then, Dr. Misbah, the journalist in me would be remiss if I didn't ask you about a fast food jihadi, because it appeals to my journalistic sensibilities as a description. I couldn't help but think, as you were speaking, given how quickly they become radicalized, are they equally sort of able to be unradicalized as quickly? That is, it seems to me if one spends years becoming radicalized, they're much harder to bring back, if you will. Is there a potential with someone who's radicalized in a few months in terms of how the international community, how local government brings them back? Is it enough to bring economic development or a sense of protection to unradicalize someone, given how quickly they radicalize to begin with?
Yeah, I think I think on many cases, I mean, this radicalization and de-radicalization story are present. So you can see that some of them actually who traveled to Syria went, and after a few months they returned back, and they preferred to surround themselves to authorities and spend the prison sentence instead of staying there and die in Syria. And these are people who have no ideological component in, or affinity with jihadism. They went to Syria because of psychological appeal of seeing that a lot of Syrians has been dead. So when they went there and they saw the conflicts among the different jihadi groups, etc., so they decided to return. So in that cases, there is few works to be done. I mean, just to work on some psychological counseling, to some advice to reintegrate in society afterward. I don't know how many of them are in this case. This is a very easy job for this category of people who has been on at an early stage of they saw on TV what's going on, and then simply they decided to go with 3 or 4 of their friends. But the question is how to deal with hardline or people who started to be convinced with the jihadi ideology. I think it's complex, and here authorities need to develop a kind of filter or a vetting system to see the different categories of jihadis who are ideologically involved or indoctrinated at a deep level. Then there will definitely need an ideological dialogue. I disagree maybe with the current approach in Morocco, at least, that they only who want to have a dialogue, I mean, to discuss only with those who voluntarily want to participate in the program of Musalaha, but actually you need to have a dialogue with everybody, including the hardline jihadi, and then try to enter in a tough, rigorous, internal religious discussion among scholars between the radical and the moderate, and then try to convince them. I know it's not easy. I know it's not for sure that it will have consequences, but dialogue is a very important component, because, I mean, part of the problem of radicalization is the absence of dialogue. I mean, if they had dialogue in their family, in their communities, they wouldn't go even at the beginning. But actually, it reveals a bigger problem that has to do with the changes of social values, etc. But sticking on this issue, it's a variety of profiles, and it's really very difficult to come up with 1 or 2 categories. We have, as Mr. Akrud said, it's each case on its own, but there should be a policy, a comprehensive and inclusive policy that deals with all these different categories.
And then I just wanted to ask everyone on the panel one last question before I open it up to questions. You know, we've heard about the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Ansar al-Sharia, even Hezbollah. We've heard about radicalization, financing, money laundering, youth radicalization. And I'm curious, just for the audience, if you could kind of give us a sense, the primary threat as you see it, foreign fighters, I should include that list, the primary threat to the region as you see it, if you were to list it or as you think about it, can you give us a sense? And maybe Dr. Masba, I'll ask you to start us off in terms of how you see the threat, how you measure threats. What do you see as the primary threat? When we're thinking about it, is there one that dominates one over the others?
What's against?
So if you were to sort of rank threats, we've talked about radicalization, we've talked about youth, we've talked about economics, we've talked about various groups trying to make their way into the Maghreb. I'm just curious, what for you is sort of the one that you're watching first and foremost? What is the most important one to you above all else?
Yeah, they are different in nature, but I think unemployment and social fragility is the most important issue that we need to address. And then it's the question of democratization and good governance, because if you don't have these two elements, good governance and social equality, then it will spread all different kinds of problems, not only radicalization, but criminality, illegal immigration, and all different kinds of problems. So I think the two main challenges for the next 10 years in the North African countries is these two: unemployment for young people and a good democracy record.
Yes, in two words, it might be, I think, economic inclusivity. It's the most important thing in the region, because we are in kind of mercantilist system, you know, with lots of corruption and regulations that it needs, and lots of people are discriminated from inside the countries. They cannot access to business or to credit, and it's fundamental. So it's the first thing that's nurture lots of relative deprivation and frustrations. It's the economy. The lack of inclusivity, and after it's the crisis of succession. And the third, it's the fact that regional powers will project their rivalries in Libya. It's very dangerous, very, very dangerous.
I mean, I think you could come up with a lot of social and local political issues, but I think as a national security counterterrorism professional, if I was responsible for that in those countries, outside of my own country, I would be worried about the dynamics in Libya and Sinai. I don't think you can disaggregate Sinai. Inside my country, I would be worried about the prison population, because the de-radicalization programs are nascent. And so as you have people coming out of prison and normal criminals in prison being interacted with the jihadis that are there, I just think that's what I would be worried about.
I'd like to open it up to questions. If you are chosen to ask a question, if you could give your name and the organization that you're affiliated with. And I'll start right here. And if you could please wait for the microphone.
Hi, Bill Lawrence, George Washington University. Excellent panel, I really enjoyed it. And obviously you can't cover everything in a panel, but I just wanted to point out two things and get your reactions. One was, and this is particularly at Mr. Monsbach, I mean, your argument about jihadi, what was it, fast food jihadis, is almost argued against by 3 or 4 other things you said about the incubation of grievance. And so I would argue that I mean, Rami Khouri recently came up with 65 different reasons people join ISIS, and I'm looking forward to just looking at the list, because you'll be able to group the, but, you know, most of the deep and anecdotal and other types of research show that humiliation and humiliation triggers are often a thing, and those humiliations can happen much younger than 3 months before. And which gets me to a point about the structural arguments. I mean, the structural problems and the structural responses are important, but 99% of socioeconomically disfavored youth don't become terrorists. So, you know, what's the issue? What are the issues of the less than 1% of socioeconomically disfavored youth who become terrorists? And there are many, many aspects to this that have to be addressed. I'll name one. Neighborhood intervention. Most terrorists come from the same neighborhoods. You can pick 4 or 5 in Morocco, 4 or 5 in Tunisia, and then Algeria, it's a different phenomenon. But
that is, if I'm hearing you correctly, there are socioeconomic problems throughout the region, and yet such relatively few number go on to become
a tiny
jihadists.
Number of socioeconomically disfavored.
What is the distinction? What is that sort of trigger?
Well, it gets down to, and maybe I'll make this my last point, you guys are absolutely right that it almost has to be individual level profiling and individual level interventions, and I agree with everything that was said on that level. But it's really complicated stuff. But you have to get into like the triggering mechanisms that force people, and often those aren't in that 3-month period. It goes back deeper, and so there's a whole sort of psychological side of this. And if I can add one more point, there's the whole cult deprogramming literature, which needs to be worked into this, because indoctrination involves, you know, there are techniques to unindoctrinate people. So I'll stop there.
Dr. Mesbah, do you think it's something that is sort of almost individual in terms of a approach, and if so, that's a daunting prospect for any government? How does one go about it if that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, to understand radicalization, there are three layers. The first is the structural level, which encompasses all the economic, political environment, and also the political opportunity after 2011. You know, after the security vacuum that occurred in different countries, provided an opportunity, and also some government turned a blind eye on people who wanted to travel at a certain point. And also the second level is ideology. It's very important also to understand the process of radicalization, because it's the software. The hardware is the infrastructure, but the software is ideology. It's the jihadi ideology. It's very important to understand it, but it's not the main driver, as I said. The main driver, and the third level actually is the individual level. On a broader level, I mean, the academics try to analyze either through these two levels, either the structural level or the ideology. You know, the Islamization of radicalization of Islam. This is a long debate, but actually they don't give much importance to the agency, to why those specific people among millions of Muslims across the globe choose to join jihadism. And here I think the third level, and it's very important, is the individual motives. And it's also should not be neglected, because people have their own motives. There are millions of people who has been marginalized, humiliated, on the same conditions and the same family, and sometimes you see one joining. And then I think it's very important to look at the specific individual choices and to the agency, and how people try to justify and rationalize their choices. And sometimes it's not really it's not a linear channel that you can say, for example, a well-educated should not be affected by this ideology. Last week, it's fair in an astonishing way, in a surprise, a Moroccan professor of philosophy who was known for his posts on Facebook against Islamists and all kind of religious ideologies. Last week he traveled he traveled last month and joined Daesh. So it was against all the expectation of people, because he was, yeah, I mean, you don't know why, but this was a case that you can say only poor and people in unfavored situation join jihadi, but this is a counterexample, and there are other counterexamples, but the pattern is that people under the age of 25 who are male, living in a big and medium cities on the shanty towns, are more exposed to this ideology.
Of course.
I just want to take 20 seconds to answer this. If I put my academic hat on, what you're basically saying is there's no control group. That is, we have all these people who are joining, but we don't know why people don't join. And about 5 years ago, I did a series of studies on why individuals do not become terrorists, which is your control group factor. And we did we did surveys and focus groups and individual semi-structured interviews in the Palestinian West Bank. There are no barriers to become a terrorist in the Palestinian West Bank. You want to join PIDS, you want to join Hamas, you want to join Fatah, you know somebody who knows somebody. So we looked at why people don't join. And then we did Yemen. And we finished up the Yemen study in 2015. And we looked at why people are not joining violence, aren't participating in violence in Yemen. So I recommend them to you. Google my name. And they're the only ones out there who answer the control group question. The fast food jihadi issue, I just want to say, I don't want to underplay, because it's rapid, it's not a genuine radicalization. I don't think that's true. I think this is, the earlier panel talked about the importance of social media and the internet and how the role that it is playing in radicalization, I think, is important. And it's not the only explanation for the quick increase of radicalization, but it's a huge part of it. And the example I use when I talk about this is my daughter, who has a FaceTime relationship with people, and she will play games with people on FaceTime for 2 hours. And it's a very real relationship, and she views them as somebody who's in her life just like somebody who has a physical relationship in her life. And so as individuals develop relationships through social media online, we don't see it as much because it's not face-to-face and it's hard to intervene from a security relationship, but this is a real relationship that helps radicalize people. And so I don't want to diminish that important role because it's very, very hard to deal with from a policy perspective.
Thank you. Yes, sir. If you'll just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Dave Ottaway from the Wilson Center. One of the distinguishing features of the Maghreb is the importance of Sufism. And a lot of government people and academics are beginning to equate moderate Islam with Sufism. Is it your feeling that Sufism is playing a role as a barrier to the radicalization of the youth or society in general? I mean, I was just in Morocco and they were talking about 2 million Moroccans out of employment and out of school, which is a huge category from which to recruit your jihadis. But is Sufism significant as a barrier to the attraction of extremism in Islam?
Maybe about Sufism, yeah. In fact, it has been used. The Sufism has been used by Algerian during the 90s and Morocco too. You know, against jihadism. We know that. But the problem is that the fact of promoting Sufism is successful when the confrérie are not seen by the population too close from the state, and at the same time, the state must have enough credibility. And if there is no that, it doesn't work, you know, because people knows that these people are representative of the state and of the police and things like that. But it can be done, yeah. I won't say de-radicalization. I say it's an alternative. But it depends on the way Sufism is anchored in the country. It depends on the tribal balance and the clan balances and things like that. But at the end, yes, it might work. In Tunisia, there are some debates about that, you know, about reactivating this the Sufism. At the other, just maybe to add something about that, the de-radicalization, about the Wahhabism and all that stuff. The way we frame the problem of radicalization, I think, is in favor of Wahhabism, because Wahhabism, what some people call in Libya, it's Madkhalist or Quietist Salafist. Or that, there are some differences, okay, but it's very minor. Is the best way to de-radicalize people, in a sense. You know what I mean? It means that people can think to speak with jihadis because they have a doctrinal base, a common doctrinal base. But at the end, it's much more complicated. It's much more complicated, and I think that the best way of what we say de-radicalizing, it's much be to offer to people in these countries the possibility to have anti-systemic ideas, but to express them peacefully. And if there is no that, you can radicalize everything. At the end, there will always be utopia and things like that, and people ready to die.
Right here.
William Zarbin from SAIS again. Two related questions. A recent study on the Sahel showed that a state-sponsored, established Islamic organization was effective against radicalization. And I wondered if there's a comment on that. This is in the Sahel area. And second of all, in Morocco, how does Alwa Ihsan fit into the Daesh, Al-Qaeda relationship?
Dr. Mesbah, would you tackle the second question first, please?
Yeah. Actually, the question whether the religious reforms or this kind of discussion that includes Sufism and promoting moderate Islam is effective in deterring jihadi ideology, I can say yes and no in the same time. At a broader level, yes, it might infuse moderate ideas within society if you do it with changing of manuals, etc. But radicals actually does not get radicalized in the mosques or in areas where this kind of discourse is spread. Actually, they radicalize outside those areas, and especially on the internet. I totally agree that the internet is a very important vehicle, and not the written internet, it's the video component of it. And I totally agree that the fast FaceTime and all this new media has accelerated the process of radicalization. If we want to understand the fast food, jihadi we have also to understand how it facilitated the contacts, and many of the cases of people who traveled actually to Syria was done through the internet, but actually they didn't just took the decision to go, but it was actually through contacts with their peers or friends or members of families who was there, and then they facilitated the process of traveling. But actually returning to the question whether the state-sponsored Islam is effective, I think it has its own limits. It can work at some places, but not on all the levels.
What about the ex-Islam Yasin movement, otherwise?
As a tool to fight radicalization.
How does it fit in between Al-Qaeda and Daesh?
Yeah, Al-Adl al-Ihsan is a political opposition with religious background. It's a Sufi group. It's a Sufi opposition group, if we might say that. So it's not really. It might be an antidote to radical ideas because they totally disagree with the Daesh ideology. But from the state point of view, they are a challenge for the king's authority as a commander of the faithful. But I don't think they are promoting radical ideas. I mean, that leads to violent extremism, in my opinion.
Thank you. Marilyn Shapley with Mercy Corps. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the impact migration from the Lake Chad Basin or Central African Republic up into places like Tunisia or Libya might have on future security issues, including radicalization. Thank you.
Dr. Craig, would you start us off?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I was the previous question on what am I worried about, if I was given more than 2 or 3, that would definitely be on my list. I really focused on North Africa, but I think if you broadened it geographically, then the issue of what I talked to about regional foreign fighters, that's taking really place around there, especially as you go into countries which have, I mean, it was mentioned previously that the border with Libya is difficult, but I mean, go down to Mali and look at those borders and it gets so much worse. So I think that as you go further south, the issue of regional foreign fighters becomes a bigger concern. And then the issue of monitoring, assessing, information sharing, all of the things that we said were hard with North Africa become exponentially more hard as you go south.
Dr. Ayari, is there anything you wanted to add?
Thank you. Reda Liamori, independent researcher and consultant. My question is to Dr. Masbah. about returned foreign fighters. In Tunisia, we have Uqba bin Nafi of AQIM. In Algeria, we have small cells that pledge allegiance to ISIS, in addition to AQIM, to absorb these foreign fighters. And in Libya, there is no shortage of groups to absorb these foreign fighters. Do you see any group playing that role in Morocco, for example? Any group that's going to absorb these foreign fighters and impose a threat to Morocco? That's the first question. A quick question to Dr. Craig. You said 120 attacks related to foreign fighters as of October. Can you break down this attack? Like, as far as we know, there are none in Morocco and less than 5 maybe in Algeria and probably less than 20 in Tunisia. So I'm assuming the majority are in Libya, unless you have another breakdown. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, the question of returnees has attracted less public debate in Morocco than in Tunisia, because actually people maybe trust their government in that level. But actually, to assess how the returnees has been dealt with, I think it's very interesting. There is now at least 250 Moroccans who returned, and most of them has been put in jail, or all of them actually has been jailed for between 2 to 10 years. And after the change of the anti-terrorism law in 2014, that included heavy provisions on people who traveled to Syria or outside. I mean, many people actually are hesitant to return for that. But there is something that we should take in consideration, that after the crackdown on Daesh in Syria and Iraq, there is a lot of Moroccans who want to return, but they are stuck in there. They can't return because of the difficult security situation in Syria. They are afraid to be killed by Daesh or other militant group. And we don't know yet whether they have been de-radicalized or disillusioned and they want to return or not. But there are some people who are in between, neither fighters nor returnees. But this situation, I think, has not been addressed, how to deal with those people who want to surrender themselves, but they cannot do that. I mean, it's a very, this is undebated subject. And I don't know, but there is many of returnees who returned because they were disillusioned, and they prefer to surrender themselves in the Moroccan embassy in Turkey, and then they return to Morocco. What else? Whether there are some people who really are planning to do something, we don't know. We don't know the rate of recidivism after they got after they leave the prison. So it's a very difficult answer.
And Dr. Craig?
Yeah, quickly, I do have it broken down by country. I don't have it right here. So if you want to send me an email, I'm happy to give it to you. My data includes attacks and plots. Then the plots become difficult because some countries will arrest somebody because they were exchanging emails with somebody else, but there's no actual real plot there. So for me, an explosive device has to have been built. So there has to have been real action taken towards the plot. In my head, the bulk are Libya, Egypt. So I think your gut instinct is correct, but that's what I have in my head, yeah. Yeah. He's just been trying I told her you've been trying for a long time to get a question in.
Yes, thank you for remembering that there is a right side to this room.
Sorry.
Munji Dawadi from the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. Looking at the region, the Maghreb in general, and the different political systems that actually govern these places. You have monarchy, infusion with the parliamentary system. We have heavy presence of military, maybe influence on the government in Algeria, then the transition democratic system in Tunisia, and I don't know what to call Libya. Is there an influence on whether on the presence of these terrorist groups or radicalization in the region? Is there any one of these systems has been more effective in dealing with whether it's dealing with the presence of terrorists or the prevention of radicalization.
Dr. Ayari?
I don't know if you mean if there is an influence of the political system on radicalization? In terrorism, you mean? In terrorism. Yes, of course, there is. There is, yeah. We know, we see the Egypt of Sisi, for example, we see the difference, we see, of course, there is. But it depends on the context, you know. But yes, there is an influence, a direct influence. The fact is that in Libya there is no political center. We cannot call that a state. There is the NOC and the central bank. Of course, it gives lots of latitude to jihadist group. In Tunisia, it's I won't say it's the democracy. Yes, we say it's democracy. It's much more that we call the consensual democracy. It means the domestication of political Islam and all that stuff. Of course, it has an influence. If in Tunisia there has been a polarization between the inspired Muslim Brotherhood, Nahda, against Nida Tunis, what we call the secular or the nationalist, as you wish, of course, it will not be not a civil war, but lots of people who might have died. So I think it's a good choice to do that. And Algeria and all the other, they have their own capacities, and because they knew the problem for years and years, and the problem is the lasting and the durability of their regime. That's it.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I just want to thank our panelists for not only delving into the nuance of some of the very complicated issues before the Maghreb, but also allowing us to deal with the broad themes and topics that we should be thinking about, not only as we think about the region, but also what applies to each specific country. So I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists for a very illuminating conversation.